Hello and welcome to A Crawl Through Time, a brief history of herpetology. My name is Dallin Kohler, and this is my co-host, Jacob Searcy.
Hello.
Jacob, can you introduce our other co-host?
So this is Taylor. He's a Great Basin gopher snake. He's about 4 years old, and he is a sweetheart, so he's joining us today.
Sweet. Thank you for coming, Jacob. Thank you for bringing Taylor.
Mm-hmm.
This video is being created for a class project, but herpetology is something that Jacob and I are actually super interested in, and it has been pretty interesting to do a little bit of research on the history of herpetology. So Jacob, thanks again for helping.
You're welcome.
Quick disclaimer, neither of us are historians, and while I'd say that we both know a fair amount about herpetology, we're not really familiar with its history, and this isn't intended to be a comprehensive overview of herpetology, and it will definitely have a North American bias. We're just trying to give a few cool snapshots at some different points and trying to identify some broader trends.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, enough with the disclaimers. Let's define what herpetology is for some of our uninitiated listeners. I guess herpetology is the study of reptiles and amphibians, and it comes from the Greek word herpes, which means to creep or to crawl, same root as the STD. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Also the same as creeping things in the Bible or scriptures when you read those. Yeah.
So reptiles and amphibians, they are very different, but a lot of them do creep or crawl. And they were originally grouped together by our man Linnaeus, who we'll talk about a little bit later. And herpetologists today affectionately refer to reptiles and amphibians as herps, as this umbrella term. Jacob, pop quiz, can you name all 8 extant groups within reptilia and amphibia?
So in amphibia, there is Sicilians, which is apoda, correct?
Yeah, or Gymnophiona.
Gymnophiona, yes. The naked snakes. There's Anura, the frogs, and then there is Caudata, the salamanders.
Good.
And then in reptiles, there's the crocodilia, or Archosauria, depending on where you're grouping it. The turtles, which are testudines, the squamates, which are snakes and lizards, the rhynchocephalia, which are the tuataras. There's only one living species. Did they get split into
I think
two?
they put it back to 1.
Okay.
Yeah.
Rhynchocephalia, and then the birds, aves.
Oh, good job.
Yeah.
Okay. I wasn't sure if you'd remember the birds.
Yeah, but if you're my man Linnaeus, there's only 2, and they are the amphibia, which is the reptiles, amphibians, and bizarrely boneless fish. He lumped like chondrichthyes and anything that wasn't a bony fish into amphibia. And then the aves, the birds.
Cool. All right, good job there, Jacob. So today, for our exploration of the history of herpetology, I've kind of broken things down into 3 general areas, each of which is going to get turned into a separate video. Part 1 is going to be early herpetology, which is roughly before 1900-ish. Part 2 will be the 20th century, and then Part 3 is going to be modern herpetology. So let's do this. All right, let's jump into early herpetology. So before 1900, there were very few true herpetologists. There were a lot of early naturalists and a couple that could sort of be considered herpetologists, but not very many. For this section, we're going to hit on a few of the important historical figures, most of which aren't herpetologists. We could start with the very first herpetologist, Eve, but her experiences were only with one serpent in one garden. So we're going to start with a different historical figure, Linnaeus.
Yeah, I would like to add Eve, maybe more of a parcel tongue than a herpetologist, but so Linnaeus, my buddy Linnaeus, he was a Swedish naturalist. He was a botanist, actually. He loved plants. And he was living in the early 1700s, early to mid-1700s, and he went on some adventures and decided that he needed to organize the tree of life into something cohesive so that everyone knew what everything was, because especially with plants you've got a lot of varieties and cultivars, and it's very hard to keep track of, right? So he worked and came out with a book in I believe the 1730s called Systema Naturae. He wrote it all in Latin because that's the language of science apparently. And that was his contribution to science, was this Systema Naturae. And he kind of, he created binomial nomenclature, as we call it. And basically the idea was he grouped everything into broad categories like mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians, because he lumped them together. And then he grouped them by smaller categories until eventually each individual species had a genus and a species name. Random fact, he is the unofficial type specimen for the human species, Homo sapiens, because that's who he observed and used for his, studied for his classification.
He kind of had a big head.
He did have a big head, and he did not group all people the same species. Whoopsies.
Wasn't his only mistake.
Not his only mistake. He wasn't a big fan of herps. That was another mistake of his, because they're awesome. He's credited as saying that reptiles are abhorrent because of their cold body, pale color, cartilaginous skeleton, which is wrong. They do have bones. Filthy skin, fierce aspect, calculating eye, offensive smell, harsh voice, squalid habitation, and terrible venom. And then he said, wherefore their creator has not exerted his powers to make many of them. Also wrong.
Very wrong.
Very wrong. But he did kind of, because he grouped reptiles and amphibians together, we still study them together. And because they share fairly similar life histories and morphology and things like that, it's still convenient in a lot of ways to study them together. But they're not actually what's called a monophyletic group. So a monophyletic group is an ancestor and all of its descendants. So you can kind of think of it as like a family tree. If you pick a set of your grandparents, a monophyletic group would be if you invited your grandparents and then all of their children and all of their grandchildren to a party. If you, say, left out your crazy cousin Jerry, because no one likes Jerry, that's a paraphyletic group is what it's called. It's an ancestor and most of the descendants, but you've taken one out. So herps is not a true monophyletic group because it is reptiles and amphibians. It excludes the birds, which are descendants of reptiles, and to make it truly monophyletic, you would also have to include mammals, actually. Similarly, reptiles, not actually a truly monophyletic group because you need to include the birds because they're descendants of avian reptiles.
But amphibians on its own is a monophyletic group.
Yes. Yeah, and honestly, like, Linnaeus, a lot of his science was flawed, a lot of his, like, organization was flawed, but the way that he created, the method he created for organizing things is so influential that we still use it 300 years later, and it's one of the best ways we have of expressing evolutionary relationships in animals and plants.
Yeah, and so even though Linnaeus was wrong about some things and he didn't like herps, it still has a role in the earlier history of herpetology. Yeah. So now we're going to move back a little bit in history, actually. This part's not really in chronological order. And talk about the guy who was actually the first one to publish a book on something related to herpetology, at least as far as I could find. His name is Niccolo Leoniceno. I don't speak Italian, and he was an Italian professor of theoretical medicine. It wasn't practical medicine; it was only theoretical medicine, I guess. He lived from 1428, to 1524. His book, once again, I don't speak Italian or Latin. His book was called De Serpentibus Opus Singulare ac Exactissimum, which, according to Google Translate, means the work of snakes is unique and very accurate. I don't know if that translation was very accurate, but that's what it came out to. Jacob, can you guess when the book was published?
So
1428 to 1524.
To 1524. I would guess maybe 1470s, 1460s.
Wow. It was 1518 was the date that I could find.
Wow.
So pretty close before his death.
Okay.
There's a PDF of the book online. I scrolled through it hoping to find some interesting looking pictures or diagrams. but it was just 116 pages of Latin. And so I don't really, and there wasn't an English translation either, so I don't have any more details on his book, unfortunately. Basically, I think what I read from other sources that he wrote something about snake bites and vipers and medicine, things like that. I have no clue how accurate any of his stuff was. This might have been where the idea that if a venomous snake bites you that you're supposed to suck out the venom, that might be where that came from. Maybe.
Knowing his period, you probably needed to rub it with like a magic toad or something.
Yeah, or
too.
get some leeches on it.
Probably. Yeah, leeches, yeah. So our next herpetologist that we're going to talk about is John Edwards Holbrook. And oh yes, here, grab Taylor. He lived in the 1800s. That was when he was doing his work, and he's kind of the earliest herpetologist, true herpetologist. He is, at the very least, the earliest known American herpetologist. And he wrote the first written and illustrated account of North American herps, which unfortunately was not super popular, so he actually tried to burn it. He got every copy he could get his hands on and tried to burn it in his backyard. So, because there's not a lot left, you can view it online for free. Just throwing that out there. He was kind of more of a classical naturalist. He'd go out and observe these things in the wild. He'd make pretty drawings of them and stick them into his book, along with this is my description of this animal and where it lives, things like that. He also loved fish. He was very big into fish. He wrote a book about North Carolina's fish. He was also kind of an eccentric guy, from what the sources say. He, according to Wiki, helped cure a man of his fainting spells by having him hold alligator entrails while he was dissecting it. So,
sounds like a good cure. I think that would work. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's three. I could find at least 3 species of herp that are named after him. You already know the spadefoot, Scaphiophis holbrooki. You mentioned that one. Can you name the other 2?
I remember seeing there was like a legless skink or something. A legless.
Not legless.
It wasn't legless. Was it? Oh, earless. Earless.
The genus, not the species.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
And then. I'm not sure what the other one was. I forgot. Was it a fish?
Here.
Oh. It was a king snake.
Yep.
Oh, it was the subspecies of Lampropeltis gatula.
Yes.
Yes, I do remember seeing that.
So now it's its own species. It's Lampropeltis holbrooki now.
Oh.
Named after Holbrook.
How nice.
That's why I grabbed that one. Okay.
I should have known.
You should have suspected something. Okay. All right, the next guy I wanted to talk about is an early naturalist who married his cousin, who isn't Charles Darwin. Darwin did marry his cousin. But so did this guy, Edward Cope, who was born in 1840 and died in 1897. He was a zoologist and mainly a paleontologist, and he published over 1,400 scientific papers in his lifetime, which is a lot. And he named more than 1,000 vertebrate species. This was back when none of the North American species were described. So he's just
busy
find a species, you name it, kind of a thing, which is nice. And he definitely wasn't exclusively a herpetologist, but he did actually study a lot of herps and named a lot of the herps in North America. So that's why we felt obligated to include him. Mm-hmm. The last guy we want to hit on in our period of early herpetology is named Armand David, and he lived from 1826 to 1900. He was one of the first Western naturalists to explore China, actually, and there's a famous species of Asian amphibian that is named after him. Jacob, do you know what it is?
Is it the giant Chinese salamander?
It is! Wow! That's good, yeah. We have a hellbender here, which is in the same family as it.
Imagine this, but 3 or 4 times bigger.
Yeah, like very large. The Chinese giant salamander, Andreas davidianus. And I think molecular studies have shown that it's probably 5 species, but they've had a lot of issues where the Chinese did a bunch of captive breeding programs, and now it looks like we might just be stuck basically with just one mutt species.
Whoops.
Yeah. Maybe they'll be able to get it separated, but things aren't looking too great. So David, he also discovered the giant panda, and the first thing he did, he got a skin and he shipped it immediately back to Paris. Why not, I guess. And I bring him up not just because I wanted to test Jacob's salamander knowledge further, but also because David shares a lot of similarities with other early naturalists. He was partially religiously motivated. He wanted to spread Christianity in China. That's part of the reason he was there. And he ascribed to William Paley's idea of natural theology, kind of the idea that as you see and understand the natural world, that helps you understand more of God and more of his mind, I guess. And David was also more focused really on describing species than actually studying them, which is kind of a common thread with other early herpetologists. All right, so let's wrap up our early herpetology section. What are our takeaways, Jacob?
My big takeaways are that early herpetologists were not specialized. They were just kind of exploring and discovering new species, but they weren't focused on reptiles or amphibians specifically. And there was not a lot done with evolution. It was very new at the end of the early period. By 1900, it was still fairly new. And there was a lot of species descriptions, a lot of new species. You'd go out on these adventures and find new things. And a little bit of focus on natural history, but it was very much more focused on describing and finding new things. And of course, there's the view that these things are gross.
Yeah.
Very, very lingering sort of idea.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Darwin wasn't a huge fan of herps either. He didn't do a ton with them. There's one of his more famous tales on the Galapagos Islands of him chucking the marine iguanas into the water and then having them swim back to land, and him just doing it over and over again. He also called them really ugly. Which I maybe disagree with, but
yeah, he also ate the tortoises. Apparently, that was a thing back then. If you found something new, you would describe it, and then you'd see what it tasted like. In a lot of cases, I guess. Reportedly, he liked the tortoise meat a lot. Yeah.
Can't say I will ever try it. So
yeah,
we'll have to trust him there. But yeah, and so this was obviously the period where Darwin was alive, but there really wasn't a lot of evolutionary biology research going on with herps. Nobody was really connecting any of those dots, which is very different from today. But yeah, the influence of early herpetology is definitely still around. The reason why we have reptiles and amphibians grouped together is because of Linnaeus, because of what happened in this time period. And so the influences of early herpetology should not be discounted.
Yep.
Right, Taylor? Taylor
agrees.
Taylor does agree. Taylor's going to fact check us today. If we say anything wrong, he's going to start biting us. So. All right, it is time for part 2, herpetology in the 1900s. So this is where herpetology could really be called its separate field. There's a lot more specialists that could truly be called herpetologists in this era. Our plan for this section is a little bit different. Rather than just giving you a bunch of facts about dead white guys, we're going to look at some entries in a 1954 field guide and some field notes from a 20th century herpetologist. But first, I have some more guessing for Jacob.
Oh boy, I love
sorry,
these guessing games.
So I picked 3. We obviously don't have time to cover all of the 20th century herpetologists. I picked 3 of them that have species named after them that you may or may not know. Do you want me to give you all 3 or one at a time?
Give me them one at a time.
Okay. Charles M. Burghardt. There's a whole list with this guy. So. Burghardt.
Burghardt. I don't remember this one.
Yeah, I think the only one on the list that I knew was Bogurtophis, the genus for a rat snake genus. Bogurtophis subocularis, the Trans-Pecos rat snake.
Oh, okay.
Those are good. Second one, Lawrence M. Clobber. You should be able to get this one because there's a rattlesnake.
Yes, it's a rattlesnake.
There you go.
Yeah.
Do you know what kind of rattlesnake?
No.
Banded rock rattlesnake.
Okay.
Crotalus lepidus clobberi.
Okay, yeah.
Pretty cool. And then the third one, Wilbur Tanner, who we'll talk about later. This one only had one herp named after him.
Only one herp. Is it a Utah herp?
It is not. It's a Mexico herp.
Oh, then I might not know.
Yeah,
it.
You might not. Okay.
Tannerai?
It is a Tannerai. It's Scoloporus Tanneri.
Oh, okay. So it's one of those.
It's a scallop, a spiny lizard. Yeah,
spiny lizards.
They're pretty cool. They're like
guys.
green and blue, actually. If you look up
so
later,
colorful.
They're gorgeous.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let's dive into this wonderful book I have. So this is the 1954 edition, the first edition of a Stebbins Field Guide to the reptiles and amphibians of Western North America. The Stebbins Field Guides are sort of the gold standard for herp field guides in the U.S. And we actually have all of the editions right here. So first edition, second edition, third edition, and fourth edition. The fourth edition was actually published after Stebbins' death, but the publisher knew that keeping his name on it was going to give them some more credibility. So I guess they stuck with that. All right, before we dive into this book, I want to talk about some of the ways that it kind of typifies herpetology at the time. First, the fact that it's a guide to reptiles and amphibians shows that herpetology has really become its own discipline, and that reptiles and amphibians were firmly tied together from what happened in the previous era. Mm-hmm. And second, it shows that what the focus of herpetology was. Naturalists had moved a little bit beyond saying just, okay, the species lives here and looks like this. They were more interested in natural history, kind of when the animal ate, when the animal was active, what the animal ate. They cut open a lot of specimens to see what they were eating. And they also cared a little bit more about evolution in this area. They were thinking more about the evolutionary implications of how the species spread across the United States, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the first one I picked out to look at, that we picked out, is this guy. This is Karina.
Snakes can be handled.
Yeah, Taylor loves you. So this is Karina bhati, the rubber boa. They are native to Western North America, and they can be found in Utah. They're pretty secretive, so I've never actually seen one in the wild. My parents have. No.
I've seen 2, 3, I think. 3. Not in Utah, in different places. But
yeah. My parents were just out on like a rainy night up Provo Canyon, and they saw one. They didn't know what it was. They thought it was a worm, like
they
a really
kind of look
big worm. So it says like individuals have been secured in damp sand near mountain streams, under rocks, boards, pieces of bark, and beneath and within rotten logs. Description of like how long it is, 14 to 28 inches.
This one says 14 to 33.
Yep, so they're longer now, I guess. Tail short and blunt, usually almost as blunt as head, giving rise to common name two-headed snake. No distinct neck constriction, spurs, coloration. It continues. This snake is largely crepuscular and nocturnal, but has been seen abroad in the daytime. It readily burrows in loose soil and is a good climber. The food commonly consists of small mammals and lizards. A jumping mouse was found in the stomach of an individual obtained in Idaho, and an alligator lizard had been eaten by one captured in California. In captivity, they've been observed to stalk mice, advancing with open mouth. I mean, they're boas, it wouldn't surprise me. Prey is killed by constriction. These snakes give birth to their young. There are 4 young, about 8 inches in total length, born in September to one female, or 20 to 21 were born to a different female. So it's very much more focused on like life history of the animals as well as like their natural history.
It's actually more detailed. This is the 2003, the 3rd edition. It has, that one has more details in it.
Really?
But this one does have a picture. Does that one have a picture or any sort of diagram?
It's got like a black and white picture.
Black and white.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Like a picture or like a drawing?
Oh, I need to find it again. I lost it. Yeah, so the pictures look like this. Except that's not a...
Kind of looks more like a drawing.
Yeah.
But
I think they're pictures. That's what I'm going to call them.
Does it have a map?
It does not. It has a description of where the animal lives. So it says
Are there
like...
some maps in it? I think there are. They at least have maps for some species in that one, but in the later editions, they have very much more detailed maps for.
There are maps, but they're
very vague.
They're a little more vague, yeah.
Which makes sense. I mean, they we're basing these off of just a handful of records.
Yeah. These field guides have definitely come a long way.
Yep, and they're still improving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, what was the other one?
You wanted to look at the leopard lizard, right?
Yes. Do you want to take Taylor?
Sure. I'll take my buddy Taylor.
Here we go. There we go. All right. The other species we were going to look at really quick, the long-nosed leopard lizard, Gambelia wislanzini, which at this time was in a different genus, Crotophytus, which is with the collared lizards. So they're still in the same family as the collared lizards, but they've been given their own genus now. What does it say? Occurrence principally in the lower but also upper Sonoran life zone, frequenting arid and semi-arid plains with sparse vegetation, usually found in somewhat sandy locations, but also occurs on coarse, gravelly soil and hard pan. Less commonly seen in extensively rocky areas or among sand dunes. Blah, blah, blah. It gives a list of localities. Description, adults 3.5 to 4.5 inches SVL. Is that what this one's? This is that one match?
Let me find it. 3 1/4 to 5 3/4.
Yeah, so a little bit smaller, a little bit bigger. Yeah, makes sense. It kind of gives a description of what they look like. They just have a bunch of leopardy spots on them. They're pretty cool. It says the leopard lizard is an active diurnal species, ordinarily exceedingly wary, and in some areas difficult to catch because of its great speed. They are very fast.
Yeah.
Careful stalking is usually required to capture them with a noose. When taken in hand, they will often attempt to bite and will hold the mouth open in a threatening manner, revealing the black throat lining. I didn't know they had a black throat lining.
I didn't either.
I don't know if I've actually caught these. I've seen them before, but I don't know if I've caught one.
Well, they're exceedingly fast.
Yeah, faster than I am, I guess. They're occasionally cannibalistic. They eat insects. They also may eat blossoms and seeds. That's interesting. It gives some info on how many eggs they lay, and then that's it.
Does it say anything about similar species?
No. Not that I see, no. It has a picture of them next to, I think, an earless lizard and a collared lizard.
Oh, nice.
Any other differences with the later edition?
This one talks about similar species that you might run into that could be confused for this one. They also has voice. When sufficiently agitated, may hiss and sometimes squeal. So, collared lizards and leopard lizards, yeah.
Interesting.
Love it.
Cool. All right. So that wraps up that portion. And obviously, here's the first one. In the 20th century, there's lots of herpetologists that we could talk about. You can find our spot.
Yeah.
Today we're going to focus on Wilbur W Tanner because he has a connection to this building that we are sitting in. Right now we're in the BYU Life Science Museum at BYU. Wilbur Tanner was a herpetologist affiliated with BYU. I think the auditorium in the museum is named after him. He did a ton of collecting. A lot of the stuff in our herpetology collection came from him. What was the number you said, Jacob? 5,600 specimens from him? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a lot from him. He was born in 1909 and died in 2011 at the age of 101. So for any of the concerned moms out there that think their son with a snake obsession is going to die very young of venomous snake bite, just keep in mind he lived to be 101, and a lot of these early herpetologists actually lived quite a while. So it's not as dangerous as you think. He collected extensively in the Great Basin area of the American West as well as in Mexico. And today we're going to dive into some of his handwritten field notes from a trip to Mexico.
Yeah. So this one he's talking about. Cross was slow to get started. We wanted more time waiting for them to decide where to go. After two boats had been moved, one of the men questioned the advisability of moving 4 boats when we had decided the day before to move only 2. This infuriated John Cross and precipitated a few unpleasant minutes, but permitted a clearing of the air. His notes are all like this. It's fantastic. It's like little adventure stories.
Yeah, and he starts everything with 22nd of September, left Provo at 10:30 a.m. with the John Cross party for a trip down the something river. And then he chronicles his journey from Provo to Mexico in this book.
Yeah, he talked about getting trapped behind a slow truck on one of the roads, and that was annoying to them.
Anything else to say about Tanner and his early exploits?
His handwriting was beautiful.
Yeah, it's in cursive. That's why we're struggling to read it. But
it's good cursive, though. Not gonna lie.
That's true, yeah.
I've seen some bad cursive in my days.
And so, in a lot of ways, Tanner really typifies the 20th century herpetologist. He did extensive field work, a lot of natural history research, collected a whole ton of specimens. He described a lot of species and subspecies, and there's been a lot of taxonomic changes since then. Some of the subspecies he described have been raised to full species. Some of the subspecies he's described have just been invalidated. They've just been synonymized with one species. We have a lot of those type specimens here at the BYU Life Science Museum, which is cool. Tanner published a lot, and most of the publications had just like him and 1, maybe 2 other authors, a lot of times just him, which is very different from a lot of science writing today. Most publications you'll see will have a whole string of author names attached to them. And in this era, herpetology was very descriptive. There were still lots of things to be described. He definitely proved Linnaeus wrong when he said that God didn't make very many herps.
Yeah, and conservation wasn't a huge issue, but natural history and life history became much more of a focus of the field, and less, still describing a lot of species, but less describing the species and more describing where they are, what they're doing, where they're living, and things like that.
Yeah, there's actually a really interesting thing in the field guide. It has a section on methods of collecting, and the later field guides have it too, but there's some differences. So some of the methods it lists, noosing is one. Usually people call it lassoing now because it sounds less intense, but he talks about use of eye shines, use of voice, night driving, or road cruising. It's usually referred to now. Something. He talks about tracking, and then the really good one, if I can find it, here we go, shooting. Shooting lizards with 22 caliber shot shells is, quote, a satisfactory method of collecting. Satisfactory.
I mean, actually, I can see that. When you've been out in the desert for like 8 hours and you haven't caught anything because the lizards are too stinking fast, it's time to just pull out the big guns, literally.
Yeah.
A 22, though, I would go with something a little bit smaller.
I don't know. He says a long barrel, smoothbore 22 pistol or rifle is an ideal lizard gun. A pistol is handy since it can be placed under the belt, leaving the hands free.
I would probably, if I was going to do that, I would use maybe maybe pellet and BB guns aren't so good, though, because those could get lodged in the animal and it wouldn't die. A 22, it's probably going to die.
Yeah.
So, better for the animal, more humane. But, like, something smaller to stun it, maybe?
Yeah, after that, it was, if a gun is not available, only if it's not available, then a slingshot can be used or a rubber band pistol.
Yeah. We've used rubber bands before. That was fun.
I'm not as good with that.
Me neither.
Yeah. Okay. So part of that, though, is it felt like in this era that extinction seemed like a long ways off thing still. They weren't really worried about the impacts, definitely not of their collecting, which obviously was a small amount anyway, but they weren't really that worried about herps disappearing.
Yeah, and but one of the big things that did start to happen in the 1900s was that they started to put all of the species that they've been describing into more of an evolutionary context as well, how they're related to each other. 1900s, big time for it.
Yeah, for sure. I think that about wraps it up. All right, it is time for part 3, modern herpetology, which I'm going to define roughly as the last 20 years or so. So it kind of coincides with our births, more or less. That wasn't kind of what the distinction was on, but we'll get into it. So there is an ever-increasing number of herpetologists in the modern era, and it'd definitely be impossible to cover them, and we already missed a bunch of previous herpetologists. So for this section, rather than talk about any people in particular, we're just going to talk about 3 big ways that modern herpetology is different from previous eras. And the first way that I want to hit on is how herpetology is giving back, metaphorically, to biology as a whole. Herpetology as a science has progressed a lot, and herpetologists have gotten much more specialized. There's a lot more advanced stuff going on. And it's much more common for someone to be an expert in a specific family or even a specific genus instead of just like reptiles or herps and just like these really broad focuses of the early naturalists and even people like Wilbur Tanner that just did everything. So herpetology has gotten a lot more advanced, and as it's gotten more advanced and specialized, there's a lot of cool things that have come out of it. I mean, some people look at herpetology and they kind of say, like, what's the point? How do these creepy crawlies benefit me? Get the snake out of my house. And while I do think that's a terribly narrow-minded view to hold, there are definitely some ways that herps have been shown to be beneficial for mankind. Lots of herps produce venoms or poisons. That's one thing a lot of them are known for. And a lot of these toxins have been shown to, thanks to medical technology, shown to have interesting medical applications. There's a diabetes drug that comes from Gila monster venom. That's commercially available now. Snake venoms have strong promise for developing painkillers. I don't know if there's any that are out right now, but I know there's a lot of research going into it. What else? Salamanders can regrow body parts, including whole limbs, which is something that obviously we can't do. And that's something that scientists and biomedical researchers hope that we can learn from the salamanders to be able to help improve our own healing. And think about how many bullfrogs get dissected every year to help people learn about vertebrate anatomy. Poor bullfrog. I guess the bullfrogs deserve it. They're kind of invasive.
But they probably come from bullfrog farms.
That's true. But yeah, basically herpetology has gotten specialized enough that we are learning a lot of cool things about, or learning cool things from herps that are applicable to people. And there's a whole ton of stuff that we're learning about herps that's applicable to evolutionary biology, helping us better understand like life history strategies, things like the evolution of asexual versus sexual reproduction, trade-offs associated with that. And so there's a lot of really cool things that evolutionary biology is gleaning from herpetology too.
Mm-hmm. The next way that herpetology has kind of changed in the last few years, molecular work is huge now. Like modern gene sequencing, protein sequencing, a lot of just like these animals are being investigated on like a molecular level now as well. And so that's led to a big shift from a lot of the work being done not in the field anymore to being done in a lab with like pipettes and microscopes.
And very expensive machinery.
Very expensive machinery, yeah. And some of the ways that that's influenced the field is it's made it a lot easier to find new species, to find cryptic species. You were telling me the other day about king cobras. There's a paper out now that's suggesting that king cobras might actually be 4 different species and not just one. Same with like the Chinese giant salamander that we looked at earlier. Originally it was just lumped in with the Japanese giant salamander, but then that got split, and now there may have been split. It may need to be split again into like another 4 or 5 species. And like another thing is subspecies, raising them to full species status. That's been a pretty frequent trend lately. I've been working with a species complex of rattlesnakes here in the museum that got raised. All of the subspecies except for 2 or 3 got raised to full species status, so we're reorganizing those. And then, of course, as you were saying earlier, the medical component, it's just taught us a lot more about like epigenetics, genetics, proteins, toxins, all kinds of things. Like with the salamander limb regeneration, like those cells at the base of the limb are kept dormant until the limb gets lost, and then it'll just turn them on. And we're learning how that works, and that can be used in human bodies perhaps as well.
Sweet. The last major difference that I think has characterized modern herpetology has been the focus on conservation. I think that reptiles and especially amphibians have shown that humans are good at making things go extinct accidentally. And obviously conservation wasn't invented in the 21st century. It was long before I was born. If you go back to, I think it was 1967, there was a precursor to the Endangered Species Act that was passed in the United States, and it listed 78 species near extinction in America. So obviously conservation was on the mind. Things like peregrine falcons, DDT was a problem, and so conservation was recognized, but it wasn't as big of a thing in herpetology till later. On that list of 78 species near extinction, 6 of them were herps. And what's really interesting, when you look at online sources, they say that there were 6 reptiles and 6 amphibians that were listed, but there were actually 6 reptiles and amphibians. They were grouped together still. And so a lot of online sources repeat that there must have been 6 of each, but there were just 6. There were actually 3 of each, and I did find the original list in an old New York Times publication. Jacob, would you care to guess any of the 6 species?
Bullfrogs.
Bullfrogs are not on the list.
Red-eared sliders?
No. We're going with endangered, not invasive.
Oh, okay. Okay, endangered. I would guess... So 3 reptiles and 3 amphibians. I would guess, are hellbenders on there?
They are not.
Okay.
There is 2 salamanders.
2 salamanders. Are they...
Probably no. I didn't know most of these.
Are they lungless salamanders?
I don't know enough about them to tell you. I can look that up really quick. I don't think you're going to get them.
Okay. So 2 salamanders. A frog? Would I know the frog?
There is a frog. Probably not.
Is it a chorus toad of some kind? I don't know.
No.
Okay. I don't know about those. The reptiles, I would guess, San Francisco garter snake.
Oh,
did that make the list?
Yeah, that made the list.
Made the
Good
list.
job.
Eastern indigos, were those on the list?
No, those were not on the list. There's one more lizard, and then there's one more very large reptile.
Oh, alligators.
Yes, American alligator.
And A lizard?
A lizard,
A
yeah. You probably the
lizard.
blunt-nosed leopard lizard is one you probably wouldn't.
Oh, no.
I don't even know what their scientific name is.
Okay.
Gambalia sela.
I don't think of alligators anymore, though, because they're, like, off the endangered species list.
Yeah, now they're, like,
everywhere now.
farmed a ton commercially.
It's not just the farming, though. Like, the,
Yeah, they
the
have
Everglades and
recovered, yeah.
everything. Like, they've really worked hard to restore the habitat for the alligators and, like, promote them.
Yeah. Well, plus with the farming thing, people stopped shooting the wild ones. So
Yeah, that's fair, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. That was pretty good, Jake. That was better than I think I would have done, so I'm impressed. Yeah, so herp conservation has its roots, technically, before 2000. But really, at the same time, there were 78 species on this list, and there were only 6 herps. And there were definitely, at the time, probably more herps that were in jeopardy. So you could tell that conservationists, or that herpetologists weren't really conservationists at this area. They weren't recognizing things, they weren't advocating, probably because they didn't recognize the problem. They didn't have all the information. But really, I consider conservation to be a facet of modern herpetology, mainly because of 2 things that have come about really in the last 20 years. BD, or chytrid, and climate change. So I'll talk about BD first, or chytrid. BD is short for, I gotta butcher another name, Batrachotridium dendrobatitis. No, that's why we call it BD. It's a fungus that infects amphibians that was first described in 1997. Hence, that's kind of like our starting point for modern herpetology. Since then, BD has absolutely decimated amphibian populations around the world, and herpetologists today still really aren't sure how to deal with it. There's a great book that I've read called In Search of Lost Frogs. If you haven't read it, you should get it from the library. And it's about these herpetologists that went out, I think it was around like 2010, they had a list of amphibian species that they weren't sure if they had gone extinct because of chytrid fungus. And so the book is about them going out and trying to find these, and they find some of them, but they also don't find some of them. And there's a lot of stories in the book of areas where it used to just be hopping with these frogs, and then a couple years later, chytrid comes through, and then there's no frogs left. And so it is really kind of a sad thing.
Costa Rican golden toad's like kind of the poster child for that, right?
Yeah. I think that's what's on the cover of the book. It's one of those toads. Yeah, and so amphibian populations worldwide have continued to be impacted. I just saw a study the other day. I think they finally pinpointed where they think it came from. They think it came from Asia.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
So chytrid's been a bad story for amphibians worldwide. Pollution also isn't great, and neither is climate change. Now, obviously, humans aren't going to gain anything from fungus killing all the amphibians, but we definitely helped it spread around the globe. It would not have gotten around the world in just a few years if there hadn't been people spreading it unintentionally. It's a really classic example of how good we are at unintentionally killing. We're good at intentionally killing things, don't get me wrong, but unintentionally killing things, humans are also good at that. And herpetologists really in the past 20 years have responded to this crisis. There's been a lot more environmental monitoring going on. There's captive breeding programs for a lot of the species. When they find 1 or 2 of the last individuals of a frog species, they take them in captivity and make sure that they're able to save them from going extinct, essentially. And there's also a lot more disease prevention mindful field practices where herpetologists are using gloves or sanitizing their hands when they're handling amphibians to make sure there's not that spread of disease going on.
Yeah. And then climate change, like a lot of people blame chytrid on climate change, but it may just be a contributing factor. It might not be the cause. But climate change is another big one. Okay. There's lots of implications for herpetology, of course. It's better understood now than it has been ever. And some of the ways that it can affect herps is, obviously there's the thing with habitat loss and habitat issues just based on climate change, drought, and heavy storms and whatever. But also a lot of like lizards and turtles and crocodilians, they have what's called temperature-dependent sex determination, where the embryo developing in the egg goes through a certain window. It's about like a couple days to a week long, where it decides what sex it's going to be based on what temperature is around it. And with some species, there's like this sort of like window where like in this mid-range temperature it'll create mostly males, and then the 2 outer temperatures will create females. In some it's flipped, And in some, it's like higher temperatures produce primarily males and lower temperatures produce primarily females. And so that can cause a lot of issues with like these turtles and crocodiles and alligators, because it can change the balance of how many potential mates you might have. You know, if there's like a super hot year and all of the animals that are born are males, it's kind of a problem. And then like habitat change generally, like there's people everywhere. It seems like Utah's growing real fast, and the destruction of native habitat to build houses or farmland or anything, that can also really impact a lot of native species. Some of them, like gopher snakes, garter snakes, red-eared sliders, they do just fine. But a lot of like more specialized things, especially amphibians, because they have such permeable skin and because their life cycle is so dependent on fresh, clean water, a lot of them don't have an easy time adjusting to living around people, living near human habitation, and so conserving wild space is a big deal too.
Mm-hmm. Sweet. All right, so to wrap up modern herpetology in a minute, there's been a lot more of an emphasis on conservation. There's been molecular work has revolutionized herpetology, and what was our other thing? That because herpetology's gotten a lot more specialized, it's also been able to contribute to other areas of biology in ways that it didn't before.
Yeah.
Stay tuned for the conclusion. Okay, all right, so let's wrap up our 3 areas, and then we'll engage in a little bit of speculation after that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so just kind of like starting off with the early period, there was a lot of descriptive stuff, a lot of species description, lots of like new discovery, exotic adventures, and like finding these cool exotic animals, you know.
Yes. Yeah, and also early herpetology is where reptiles and amphibians get put together, kind of a thing. But it's not really until our second area in the 20th century where herpetology really becomes its own specialized discipline, where there's real herpetologists running around. And they're still describing lots of things. There were still lots of things to be described. But they were also more focused on the natural history, just describing things where they are, but also kind of what they're doing, what they're eating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then moving into the modern period, we still do a lot of those things. We discover new species and we describe their natural history, but it's become much more conservation-focused and a lot more focused on molecular studies, genetics, and like using genomes to like find new species instead of just going out and like traipsing through the woods and shooting lizards.
22.
Yeah. And also with the new advances in technologies and things like that, you've had like new medicines come out and new treatments and things like that. And so herpetology has also come into its own sort of more generally applicable nature.
Mm-hmm. All right, are we ready to speculate on the next
Yes.
50, 80
Yeah,
years?
ready.
I don't know.
Yeah, so just some of my thoughts about like what might come in the future. I think conservation obviously is going to continue to be a big deal. I think we will probably see a lot more done with like maybe captive breeding or like activism, things like that. I think citizen science, honestly, is going to be a huge thing. Like iNaturalist, I think, is like revolutionizing the sciences. I know at least in Utah they're using iNaturalist to try to track wild river otter populations because the DNR has a hard time with that because otters are tricky to track.
It's hard to find otters.
Yeah. And so having people out there just tracking them and reporting them is very helpful for these wildlife scientists and conservationists. I think that along with that, the exotic pet hobby, I mean, Taylor's exotic, but he's not exotic. He's a native animal. I think that the exotic pet hobby is going to probably become pretty important at some point. I was watching something about like a reptile expo, and like a lot of the animals that you can find at these expos and like in people's collections are very unique. There's not a lot of like zoos working with them, and so I think that with the private pet keeping industry, there's a lot of people who like find something cool that's not necessarily being bred in zoos, but is endangered in the wild or struggling in the wild for whatever reason. And they're able to just devote like a ton of time to it, baby it, and try to help it out and figure out how to breed it in captivity, what conditions it needs. And I think that that's going to be pretty important in the future too, especially with conservation work. Not only does it provide like a nice sort of like backup plan in case species do go extinct, but I think it also allows us to like see more of like what sort of conditions these animals thrive in, and so we can use that when we're doing conservation to say, okay, this thing really needs like wetland habitat, because in captivity it doesn't do well on anything that's not like soaking wet, you know. And so I think that that'll be a big influence on the field in the future.
Do you think along with that there'll be more like regulation? Like it seems like every so often you hear about like new states passing laws or regulations, and I feel like in a lot of ways there needs to be more regulations, because you hear about like when a new species is described, people don't publish the locality a lot of the times, because when they do, collectors will go out and collect as many as they can from that locality. Because of the exotic reptile trade, those newly described species are super valuable.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think about like the legal aspects of
Yeah, that? So I've been reading that book that you gave me about the dragonfish, the Asian arowanas, which are endangered in the wild. I also like been, just thinking off and on about like eastern indigo snakes, California red-sided garter snakes that are not California, San Francisco garter snakes, which are pretty endangered, and honestly, I think there needs to be different regulation. I'm almost never pro more regulation, because I want to live my life and not have someone else breathing down my neck. But
don't you want to let the snakes live their own lives?
I do want to let the snakes live their own lives. I just think that I think that in a lot of cases when the government gets involved, things just get sticky and they get expensive, and people will do what they want, I think, honestly, different regulation is better. Like for example, one of the ones that I've thought about a lot is the San Francisco garter snake, because they're gorgeous. I love colubrids a lot, Taylor. And I would love to have a San Francisco garter snake someday, because they are gorgeous. They're stunning. But it's illegal in the United States, unless you're a zoo, to have these things.
You could open a zoo? I
could open a zoo. Do you have $1 million?
I don't.
I'm going to need $1 million if anyone wants to Venmo me.
Yeah.
But you can't have them in the United States as a private owner, and they're very endangered in the wild. There's only a couple of places that they live, and part of the issue is like habitat loss, but part of the issue also is that in the wild they specialize in feeding on a specific kind of frog, from what I understand. And it's the frog that's suffering, but the frog isn't as heavily protected as the garter snake. And so the garter snake would do just fine if the frog was more protected. But because the frog isn't, the garter snake is still struggling. But in Europe, it is legal to have California not California red-side, it's San Francisco garter snakes. They are a subspecies of California red-side. It's legal in Europe to have these and to breed them, and so lots of people in Europe have them. And I feel like if you regulate or ban something, in a lot of cases it doesn't necessarily stop the trade.
The market just moves underground.
The market just moves underground, and the prices go up, which is great for the smugglers. And so I feel like maybe with I know with eastern indigo snakes, it's legal in most states to have an eastern indigo snake. You just can't cross state lines with it without a federal permit. And that's kind of their way of regulating those and preventing them from being taken from the wild as much and sold across state lines, is that you have to have a permit that says this is a captive bred eastern indigo snake, and I'm going to move from this state to this state, or I'm going to sell it to someone in this state. And I think something more along the lines of that might be helpful. You know, like something that allows the continued captive breeding of these things, the continued captive keeping of them by private collectors who can, you know, spend more time with them than a zoo can, or who there's more of them than zoos, honestly. Like, that's another big thing, volume. Like, something like that can allow us to work with these things in private hobbies, but still keep some degree of control over it, just to ensure that they're not being taken from the wild.
Cool. Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of your takes. I think that, like going back to what you said earlier, I think citizen science is definitely going to be an ever-growing facet of herpetology and other areas of organismal biology. I think that the trend towards specialization, I think that's going to definitely increase. It's definitely not going to go away. I think you'll have a lot more continued specialization. I think one really interesting thing, one frontier for field studies, is with technology improving, we're able to get trackers that are smaller and smaller and cheaper and cheaper. And so there are studies with herps where they do put trackers into them, but it's mostly with like medium to large size snakes or things like crocodiles, where the weight of the tracker is not going to bother the animal. But as we're able to get smaller trackers, and especially ones that are able to have like the GPS locations recorded instead of like having to go out with a transmitter and find the animal, I think we'll be able to get a lot more fine spatial detail on animal movements, especially on smaller taxa that we weren't able to monitor before. I think that'll be an interesting thing to watch in the next few years.
Yeah. That would definitely make your your king snake research a lot easier.
Yeah. Since we have a little bit more time, I have to mention this book that I recently read called "The Secret Social Lives of Reptiles," and it essentially like explained like a lot how it's really a misconception that reptiles aren't social, and a lot of that's because when we haven't studied it, and two, that they're hard to observe or they're not necessarily interacting in the same ways that we are, since most reptiles aren't very vocal, though there are some exceptions. And I think that, like, as we get more data and do more studies, that we'll be able to that's one thing that will come to light more. And
yeah, and I think tracking data will help with that as well. Like, when are they coming together and when are they going apart, sort of a thing.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, I think there's always going to be people that are like out in the woods, flipping logs, looking for snakes, and I think that herpetology is...
Of course, that's half the fun of it.
Yeah.
It's more than half the fun.
Yeah, that's most of the fun.
Yeah, and I think that, like, there's always going to be something new to find, you know, always going to be something new to discover, and I think the more we learn, the more we're going to, like, find new avenues to investigate, and that'll be really fun as well.
All right, well, hopefully you've enjoyed this history, this crawl through time, our little history of herpetology, and our little bit of speculation at the end. Jacob, thanks for coming. Thanks for doing this. This is for my project, but Jacob was willing to contribute his time for something he loves, so that was great.
Sit down and talk about herps for like an hour? Oh, please, I'd do that.
And thank you, Taylor, for coming, for being so well behaved. Thanks for watching.
Thank you,
leave us a comment if we said anything that was wrong or that you disagreed with, or if you need to Venmo us money so we can start that reptile zoo.
We'll post that in the comments.
All right. Peace.